Tell me what's been going on with Decent because we haven't been in touch too much recently, and I know that you're building a lot of machines these days. I know you expanded the factory. I know the machine's changing, so your production has radically changed.
Yeah, the usual model in Silicon Valley, which is where I came from before coming to Hong Kong, is to get loads of venture capital and to hire all these salespeople and build tons of stuff and then hope that your business takes off.
Yes.
When it's your own money, you're a bit more cautious. And this company is Bugs, my partner, my money, and her mother. And so we wanted to make sure a couple things. One is we didn't go broke because this is our life savings in this.
Yes.
But secondly, that we didn't put a product out that got a bad reputation. There's a lot of launches, and you can think back to some of the hype stuff from the last few years, even from big companies, that is gone because they launched too quickly.
Yep. Totally.
And with this machine, this espresso machine, whose goal was really to be the first, I'm going to say, scientific espresso machine. And what I mean by that is everything before it is pre-scientific, didn't really measure.
Yeah. Right.
And I was pretty sure that we'd get really big things wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we did. So the first batch was only 280 machines over a year. And then the second batch, 750. And then finally with the third batch, we actually got the product in a pretty good shape. And sales were really slow. Actually, a year and a half ago, we sold 27 machines a year and a half ago in January. And so we went on the road, and then COVID happened. And we actually got really lucky in the sense that the product was good at a time where people working at home really needed it there.
Yeah, totally.
And so, so sales just went up. And our ability to make the machines was totally not there because we had just been fixated on making good product. So Bugs and I moved back to Hong Kong in end of July and hired and have finally found the magic sauce. This month I think we're shipping 290 machines.
Wow, 290. Amazing. Well, I got to say, I have one of those machines in the first batch, and even though there were things that you weren't happy with about it, it works great. I have never had a serious problem with it. I mean, because you've got the software-hardware integration, a lot of software updates, firmware updates have made the machine better and fixed things,
Yeah. From the very beginning also, because Ray, who's the hardware genius who imagined all this and created it, he's also a heavy software guy. And so the Decent, I went through 4 years of R&D to get to become something that we wanted to build. And what we built was essentially a coffee computer. And by that, I mean, you can run any software on it, right? You can do it. And at the time, I would ask you questions like, hey, do you think temperature profiling would be interesting? And your initial response was, no, totally not. There's already 2 machines on the market. They failed. No one wants that. Like, okay. But the machine can do it. So if later on, it's like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
The same thing, initially you said, what the market really wants is just like pressure profiling made simple. And I think what you were reacting to were what you knew at the time was just and what you and I, and actually no one out there realized, is that there were totally different ways of making espresso that would actually solve some long-standing problems in this field. And long-standing problem, things like light roast mostly taste acidic and nasty. Fractions are quite low. Channeling is really common. Those are things that people just accept in the espresso field that now that we've had the Decent espresso machine for a couple of years, we pretty well solved.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty thrilled, and I mean, we'll dive into some of the things the machine does and how we've kind of made espresso better, I think, later on. But I scratch my head sometimes. I'm like, what's next? Like, what can we do to make it even better? And it's like it's getting a lot harder. The low hanging fruit is definitely gone. Just the simple fact that you've pretty much made it easy to program the machine, made it easy to manage pre-infusion, doing things like blooming, which we'll talk about. It's making it easier and easier to avoid channeling and easier to get higher extractions, and that's amazing and that's exciting. And I can't, but the thing I always come back to is that I pulled espresso for 20 something years on regular machines, and I got to a certain level of competence. I mean, I pulled many hundreds of thousands of shots, so I had a lot of practice. Got to a certain level of competence, but I didn't really know what was going on during the shots. Sort of like I roasted for 12 years without software, and I could write down some numbers. Sort of like you can watch for channeling. You can write, oh, your espresso was 30 seconds. It was 20 in, 40 out, or whatever. But you have no idea what's going on in between the beginning and the end. And having the feedback of the graphs, it's one of those things. If someone hasn't experienced it, there's no way they know how valuable it is.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
completely
really
agree.
it's made me so much better.
We've got a big owners forum, so everyone who buys a machine ends up on this forum called Diaspora, and it's invite only. And one of the things that happens fairly quickly is owners get a new vocabulary. There
Yeah,
are
yeah,
words that people just use routinely, like, hey, what's your flow rate?
yeah,
That no one's ever known. And like, what do you mean you don't know your flow rate? How do you know, how are you going to pull this off?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so, and in fact, I remember Hoffman had a video recently where he said, oh, I'm going to make a really, traditional shot with this. There's going to be some, because he was trying out a bunch of grinders that were low qualities. I'm not going to try a very fancy shot. It's just going to be, pre-infusion, probably around 3.5 mils per second, rising to 7 bar, and then a decline to about 4 bar over 20 seconds.
Yeah,
Like, oh yeah, totally, something that normal people would do, when they wake up on their normal machines.
right.
So he's just completely now thinking in this way.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I don't know how he would deal with and confronting a traditional machine that's got a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean, recently when Chris Hendon put out that paper about the fast espresso shots, he was talking about fast shots, he was talking about times, he was talking about yield, and sort of like the peak extraction and all these things. And I wrote to him and I was like, what you're really talking about is high flow espresso, and if you change the language to talk about the flow rate, it suddenly becomes a lot easier to have this conversation. He was like, yeah, I just wish I had a machine that could do that, and that's what the Decent does, and it changes our ability to converse and make progress, which is great.
yeah. Um,
So all right, so we've touched upon the beginnings of this project, and I don't want to dive too deep into it, but I know that when you started, you had taken over a failed Kickstarter. And I think you did a good thing where you basically promised the people who had invested in that original Kickstarter that you were going to deliver something to them like under $1,000 in honor of the fact that they had sunk money into it. And even though you didn't have to do that for them, I think that was great. So what was the very beginning of this project?
Yeah, the very beginning is that, going way earlier, which is I just like going to great cafes as I went around the world. I originally went to my local coffee place in the Bay Area, a place called Mr. Espresso. At the time, I didn't know it was an E61, but they sold me a Rocket E61. And I struggled with it. And after 2 years of home barista and books, I sold it because I just made bad coffee consistently. Then later I got a GS3 because I figured I just hadn't spent enough money. And then I still made bad coffee with it. I had an Anfim grinder and I had good gear. And it
Hmm.
wasn't until I got one-on-one training with an Australian guy that I then 2 weeks after the training started to make good coffee.
Hmm.
And what that really taught me was like, this is just way too hard. And the reason it was
Hmm.
hard is because there was no feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then as I learned more, I also learned that the EE61 was giving me wild temperature variation in my hot water. So that was a problem. But of course, there's no temperature gauge to tell you that that's the case.
Sure.
So, there's that old adage, which is what you can't measure, you can't manage. So, so it was just in my head. So when this Kickstarter came up with these computer geeks who seem to know what they're talking about with coffee, I was like, okay, I want one. So I bought it. It never shipped. And when it crashed and burned, I thought, okay, maybe I can help out. So what happened is, like a good Silicon Valley guy, what I did is I went to where the experts are, which is Seattle.
Hmm.
All espresso machines on the planet are basically either Italy or Seattle. There's a
Sure.
few exceptions, but mostly that's the case. And I hired some consultants, in
Hmm.
fact, someone who worked on the GS3, and they looked at that Kickstarter thing and they said, you're much better off starting from scratch. because they've gone down to a path that is just never going to work. And that's my engineer said the same thing is, if you've got $1 million to spend to make this Kickstarter work, just do it from scratch.
Okay.
So that's the genesis of that. Is I had already researched whether the market made sense, and what I really wanted was like a pressure profiling small cheap machine.
Mm-hmm.
But what actually happened is, in order to pull that off, we had to go to some less expensive technology like laboratory pumps and heat on demand. And my inventor Ray very quickly realized that his boss, me, didn't know what the hell he wanted.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know enough, right? And then, in fact, no one knew enough. So he said, "I'm going to make a machine that can make anything."
Mm-hmm.
So he eventually did. It took 3 years, and he figured no matter what requirement John comes up with, I'll be able to do it.
Right.
Now, totally blew his budget in that process. But in that process, what happened is you and I got to know each other well. My level of coffee knowledge came up. You came and visited us in Hong Kong. But then I also, as we started getting betas and then you put me on tour, I started meeting people who actually knew coffee well. And I started showing them the software that I was writing. And we ended up with something that was a 3-year evolution, essentially a product that was collaboratively made between Ray, myself, you, Matt Perger, heavily on Home Barista and Coffee Snobs and Coffee Geeks, everyone piling in on every little detail down to the drip tray, and always very open about it. So, so that's the machine we built, was essentially, hey, let's advance the state of espresso together. And in the end, just the parts cost me more than $1,000. Never mind labor, R&D, all that. And when we started selling that machine at $2,000, we were losing money. At $2,500, we were still losing money. It's only now that we're actually starting at $3,000 that we make money on this machine. So cool. That's the story how we got here.
All right. Well, I'm glad we're still here. All right. I'm gonna switch gears and I'm gonna do this what feels like a little backwards, but I think it's gonna keep people's attention and it'll get people interested. I'm gonna show a graph. And I'd like to talk about this because really, when someone uses the Decent, when you're using a La Marzocco or something, you're looking at the bottomless portafilter or something like that. You're looking at a timer, and again, you don't really know what's necessarily going on in the coffee. But when you're using the Decent, what you're actually looking at is this. You're looking at a graph with now. Am I blocking the graph a little bit? Is my face blocking the graph?
You're on the start buttons. It's good enough.
Can I move myself? I don't think I can move myself, but okay. At least I'm in the least bad place I can be. Okay. Although now I've got a damn menu I can't get rid of. Hold on. There's the one bad thing about the Instagram Live is that there we go. Okay. The screen is very hard to manipulate. Okay. So what I want people to understand is that when you're pulling a shot in the Decent, you have this tablet on top of the machine, and it's incredibly intuitive. It's like using an iPhone. You don't need any instructions, basically. Like everything that happens after you've done it a couple times, you're like, oh, this makes total sense. And what we're looking at is we have this green curve, which is the pressure at the puck, and we have a blue curve, which is the flow rate of the liquid through the puck. Okay, and we have all sorts of recipes you can use. This is what we call like a pressure profile, and it's a lot like, it's inspired by the old lever machines, where the lever machine does a pre-infusion, and then when you release the lever, you shoot up to call it 8 or 9 bar, and then slowly that pressure declines, right? And this is a classic profile. I mean, this was essentially like one of the original espresso profiles in a sense, because lever machines used to be the norm. And it's beautiful because pre-infusion is really good for evenness of extraction and to get a high extraction, and it reaches a reasonable pressure. And then the slow decline helps decrease the amount of potential channeling, because as the puck erodes, it has less resistance to the water, and it's easier. If the water goes faster and faster through the puck, it's going to find channels, and it's going to basically drill holes in your puck, which is what happens in almost every espresso machine in the world. But I want to talk about graphs, but I also want to talk a little bit about how did you do this? Because even though I've known you for 3 or 4 years, this is still kind of a miracle to me that you're measuring temperature, flow, pressure. I think you once told me you're measuring pressure like 100 times a second or some ridiculous number I couldn't comprehend. So can you give me like the stupid person's version of how are you measuring this stuff and how did you do it?
So in order to measure this stuff, you've got to plop down a whole lot of money and essentially custom make your espresso from scratch for sensors. And that's one of the reasons we haven't seen this. Um, we've seen occasionally analog pressure gauges. For example, on lever machines, you can put a bike pump pressure gauge on there. But in order to measure this stuff, we had to rebuild the group head from scratch to put sensors in there. And one of the things we realized, I mean, it was cute because Ray, who wasn't a coffee guy, would ask very naive questions that were actually incredibly deep, such as, where do you want to measure temperature? It's like, oh, well, everyone just measures the boiler. It's like, yeah, but between the boiler and the coffee, what happens?
Right.
I know what happens. Why don't we put a sensor in both? He's like, okay, Ray loves complexity, so we put a sensor in both. And then a few other places too. So, but then you ask, okay, I want to measure the coffee temperature, right? So if you're making a V60 and you're pouring water and you can put a temperature probe right in there because there's no pressure and you can see what temperature your slurry is at. But espresso is under our 140 pounds of pressure per square inch. You know, it would just go everywhere if you tried that. So what we did is we built a group head and then bored a hole through everything to get a temperature sensor as close as we could to the coffee without actually affecting the coffee, because you don't want to actually screw up your shot as part of your measuring it. So you get a coffee puck, you put a little screen on top, which then holds the coffee puck down, and then we put our temperature sensor right behind it. So it's about a millimeter above the coffee, which gives us interaction effects between the coffee puck and the hot water, which had us learn a whole lot of things that you can ask about if you want to know. Pressure is actually a lot easier as long as you get yourself a digital pressure sensor. They're like $1.50. It's not a big deal. But it is complicated to build the machine such that that pressure sensor is right in there. Someone's made a Smart Espresso Profiler, and big shout out to them. Love them. And they, in fact, made a Bluetooth pressure sensor that fits into traditional machines. So it totally is a possible thing. Flow was by far the hardest thing. And flow is still a challenge for us to get really well. So flow meters work with a little windmill. It's called an impeller. And the problem is the range of espresso is both great in terms of the flow rate, and it also changes really quickly. Like you want to capture a channel, which might just go like that on the impeller. Traditional flow meters just don't do that. So if you power up any what's called volumetric machine, so a machine that stops on water volume, they will not tell you, oh, you want 80 milliliters of water in your shot. No, they will just count ticks internally because those windmill motions are very unreliable. Sometimes you get doubles or no ticks at all. And that's why until very recently, no espresso machine that I know of tells you the actual flow rate that's happening to your coffee, because flow meters don't work. So in the end, what I had to do, which was awful and cost a ton of money, is completely replicate the espresso machine in physics. So get out the calipers and measure everything so that our flow meter, which would work when the water flow was fast and then didn't work at all when it was slow, our physics engine would tell us what's actually happening.
Okay, cool. And okay, so you said measuring flow was the most challenging thing. Was that the most challenging thing in building the machine? Like I know you've had like an extraordinary number of hurdles that you've gotten over. But what was, you know, you entered this probably in a sense naively, like, hey, I'm going to build an espresso machine and it's going to be cool and it's going to be a computer. And then like every year, I'm sure you're like, holy shit, there is so much to this now. So like, what was the hardest part? Because I feel like I'm an idiot about this stuff. I feel like I'm amazed by all of it, but I even see like the effort you put into modifying the drip tray. I'm like, why is this guy spending so much effort on these little things? But like, what was the hard part? What was the hang up? Where was it like, is this really going to work?
I think the metaphor I like to use for this whole thing is the decent is an instrument. Imagine you're going to make a new instrument for musicians who've never actually played this instrument. It looks kind of like other instruments, but not that much.
Okay.
And so you build this first instrument, and then someone shows up and they bang on it some, and they're like, yeah, I can see the future, but I really can't make me do this. And you ask the musician, well, what should I change? Like, well, I've never encountered this instrument before, so I don't know. And that's basically what it was. Is like, for example, I had Slayer shots. I heard they were a good thing, and so I was like pursuing Slayer shots, and I would try and get people who supposedly knew to try it, and they're like, yeah, they don't really work, and I don't really know what's going on, and I can't give you any feedback. I'm like, well, what about this? Like, maybe. So the hardest thing was that it was a complete void, and so we would try stuff, and it would just be flat out wrong. But we couldn't, there was no website, there was no prototype machine we could ask. So I'll give you an example. When we started talking about flow profiling, experts like you and James Hoffman were excited about it for a reason that we now are totally not interested in. It was that we thought that flow profiling would make our worst shots better. So it wouldn't make our best shots better. It would just make less terrible shots. Right? And that was the focus there. And I remember those conversations. And so the focus, the design of the machine was like, let's make those worst shots better. So we focused on things like channel heating. So if you have a channel, it heals it. But no one really tried to make truly awesome shots with flow profiling.
Right.
Until like 2 years into the machine. And now we found largely that the reasons we were interested in flow profiling have vanished. Like, we're not interested in making our worst shots better. We're actually just not interested in having bad shots, period, ever. Forget it.
Right.
Like, we just want 90 plus all the time, and we can do it. And instead, this is kind of like a total mind shift. We now realize that flow and pressure are often best coexisting in the same espresso, in the same 30 seconds, which we didn't think about at the time. So most common version is most espresso machines out there that have pre-infusion talk about pre-infusion in terms of bar. And if you talk to a physicist like Ray, he goes, that makes no sense, because coffee puck is not resisting water. So how can there be any pressure?
Right. It's like pushing on a spring until you've got
it's like if you're pouring water into a sponge and the sponge is absorbing all the water. Well, there's no pressure.
Right.
So it's literally nonsense what these other machines are saying. They're saying, we'll give you a 3 or 4 or 5 bar pressure pre-infusion. We're like, well, what is that? How much water is actually coming there?
Right.
And dig a little deeper, and it turns out it depends on their tap water pressure. Okay.
Right.
So the answer is we have no idea.
Right.
So we just made pre-infusion always be flow, because nothing else makes any sense.
Right.
And then it turns out that, okay, every machine out there has you use a timer to end pre-infusion. And you go, okay, why? Well, because we don't know how much water it'll take. Well, why don't we know? Well, how would we know? Well, we'd know because it would start to resist water. It's like, well, can't you just measure it with pressure? Oh, yeah, sure. So this huge cognitive leap we made, which was pre-infusion will just always end automatically. The machine will do it for you based on the puck is now resisting water. That was massive at the time and seemed like a gimmick. And now every single shot we do does that. Because why would we want to do it differently? So the hardest thing with this machine is that we had no idea what to do. And we went down so many blind alleys and so many things that we thought were good, only to abandon them.
Right. So I want to back up to 2 things you said, because as usual, you're talking about a lot of interesting things, but like some of these are not familiar to people. So one is that we talked about a flow profile healing channels. So what John is talking about is the idea that in a traditional machine that's just trying to exert, let's just say, a certain amount of pressure, when there's a channel, the machine is going to keep exerting that amount of pressure, and it's going to exploit that channel, and it's just going to basically like make the channel worse and worse and worse, right?
It's going to increase the flow, is what's going to happen.
Right. So with a flow profile, the machine is trying to maintain a constant level of flow, and it's adjusting the pressure dynamically to do that. So when the machine encounters a channel, the flow will begin to rise because of the channel, and the machine will say, hey, I don't want the flow to rise, and it'll back off on the pressure. And by backing off on the pressure, in theory, the channel will actually fill in a little bit, and the puck will have more integrity than if it didn't do that. So our theory, although I'm not, I'm not sure that it helps us that much sometimes, but because I think that, to your point, our theory is that a flow profile can heal channels and might make bad shots better. And I think there's truth in that. Unfortunately, I don't think flow profiling has helped us. Like you're saying, it hasn't helped us make like amazing shots. It doesn't make, when you're a good barista pulling a good shot, flow profile doesn't make a better shot than a pressure profile does. Right.
So let's go back to flow profile shots, because there are a couple
Sure.
companies making flow machines, and some people think flow shots are just going to be better. In the current state of the art, that's just not true. The best shots that you're going to taste are ones where all three things are nailed. You have the flow you want, the pressure you want, at the temperature you want. And if you get one of those wrong, the shot will be substantially less good.
Right.
So that's just the way it is. So you can get the best shot theoretically from any control, but that's the first thing. So one thing that was discovered that just destroyed our ability to make good flow profiling shots. Everyone knows that the puck compresses as it pre-infuses, right? And I learned that it's around 3 to 4 bar is where that happens.
Okay.
We built our machine up to go to 13 bar because that seemed like a nice upper number. What happened though is when we started doing flow shots, is it turns out flow rises pressure to the square. So a small change in flow causes a big change in pressure. So if you're trying to make the best shot that nails the right flow and nails the right pressure, your flow knob is essentially very coarse.
Yeah. Okay.
Small
Okay.
change in flow causes a big change in pressure. Whereas if you change pressure just a little bit, your flow is tiny, tiny, tiny changes. So if you're really close to where you want to be, adjusting that pressure is a really, really fine knob, whereas flow is a really coarse knob. So that's the first problem we encountered.
But by the way, I feel so stupid. You've just totally enlightened me on why I had. Okay, now I'm like, you've educated me. That's great. Okay.
Oh, good. Radio's learned something. That's
all right. Awesome. Awesome.
I'll scratch a mark on the wall. But the second thing, which is a major discovery in coffee that no one's talking about yet, is that there is a secondary puck compression at around 10.5 bar.
Okay.
As you increase pressure, flow also increases. And then as you hit around 10 bar, as you keep increasing pressure, the flow actually decreases. Now that's contrary to what you think, right? If you have pushing, right? The more you push, the faster something's going to go.
Right.
It turns out not. So it turns out around 10.5 bar, we think, I mean, I'm talking to Gagne about this, and we think that the ground coffee particles are actually being misshapen around 10.5 bar. We're actually reshaping the coffee particles at that point so that they're going from like this to balls.
So you think the particles are changing, or you think the puck is changing?
So the particles inside the puck. In other words, everything's kind of an arrangement of weirdly shaped things.
Yeah.
And then as you hit 10 bar, you're actually causing the particles to start to bend and then pack more.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
That's what we think. That's what we think. That's our theory. We have
Right,
no
right.
evidence yet. We don't have a camera. But and the reason Gagne thinks that is that when you back off the pressure and come back to 9 bar, your flow comes back to normal. So we don't appear to be making a permanent change to the coffee puck at 10.
Right.
So the reason flow profiling is also now extremely hard to do, and you said there's nothing new to improve, just this is where the story is coming back to, is that with small changes in flow, your pressure changes. So there you are at 8 or 9 bar, you make a slight change in flow, suddenly you're at 10.5 bar, and the world goes to hell. Because now you get a secondary puck compression, your flow rate plummets, you get nasty flavors, and people go, well, this flow profiling is too hard to dial in.
Right.
So what I've got on my desk right now is a beta version, and I have to integrate it into my software that lets you do flow profiling, but with a pressure ceiling. So what you can do is say, don't go above 9.5 bar, because that's the point at which more flow gives us more pressure, which then decreases flow.
Right.
I think that this is the secret sauce that will let us do flow profiling. Now, someone just said differential equation. One of the things we also do, though, is we used to essentially slam the puck with pressure. Like you say you want 10 bar, and we like go whack, give it as fast as you can. And that would essentially cause the puck to super compress. And what we do now, we did about a year ago, is as we start to approach your goal, we back off and we gently approach the goal.
Right.
Which turns out to be a lot nicer to the puck.
Right. Okay, so in Illy's book, as we all know pretty much, that he didn't say 10.5 bar, but in Illy's book, they talked about how there was a certain point where, you're increasing pressure, you're increasing flow, and then at some point the puck resistance goes up by increasing the pressure too much. So that was a known concept, and this is what John is calling secondary puck compression. Just in case that's not clear, the first puck compression is the compression that happens when the puck gets wet during pre-infusion, and then the secondary compression is if you let the pressure go up to, say, 10.5 bar or higher, the puck is going to get even more compressed suddenly. So anyway, I just want to clarify that in case that wasn't super clear.
It's super. I see these machines that feature on the box goes up to 19 bar.
I know.
God.
I know.
You would just get mayonnaise.
Yeah. But that's super cool. I'm glad that we touched upon this because I like learning stuff from you, and I always am. One thing you brought up that I want to make people aware of is that what John was talking about when he said that instead of ending pre-infusion based on time, we end pre-infusion based on pressure. And what he's talking about is that, as the puck gets saturated with water, it resists the water more. So the puck resistance goes up. And when you use a recipe on the Decent, I want to be clear, there's a bunch of preset recipes. That's really all you ever need. You don't have to make your own recipes, and the preset recipes are awesome. But if you wanted to, you could adjust any recipe such that pre-infusion is over when a certain pre-programmed pressure is reached. So like you and I probably usually use a situation like this graph that we're looking at here. When the pressure crosses 4 bar, basically we're saying pre-infusion is over and now we're shifting to the next part of the recipe. So, I mean, and I think is it true? Usually we're finding like 3.5, 4 bar is kind of where we feel like, okay, pre-infusion's over. That's like the proof. Whereas before we didn't have proof. We were just hoping like, I hope 10 seconds is the right amount of time. And this is like a great piece of feedback that tells us that we've now moved on from pre-infusion.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got the default profile up on the screen, and you're doing a pre-infusion rate of 3.5 milliliters per second in this shot. And a very common thing I would do if you wanted to just tweak a profile is you pull this shot and then you knock the puck out and you notice there's some dry spots. And so you might be thinking, you know what, I think I'm putting water a bit too quickly and I'm rising the pressure a bit too fast and I'm not giving the water enough time to spread. So the only thing I would change in this shot is that very first thing I would say, let's just slow it down to 3 mils per second. Or the opposite, which is it's starting to drip out before the pressure has risen. So I'm giving it too much time. So I'm going to up the flow rate to 4.5 mils per second. But as a rough measure, by the way, I found that most ground coffee can't absorb water faster than 4.5 mils per second in terms of espresso.
Okay.
So somewhere in that range, typically 3 to 4.5, and 4 is the default I give. Now, traditional Italian espresso machines blast the puck, typically somewhere between 8 and 12 milliliters per second for a very, very fast compression. When the espresso starts to come out through the bottom, the whole puck is not saturated. There's dry spots there. Typically, it's taking another 5-10 seconds before the whole puck, if ever, has water. But that's a style of espresso that gets you really thick, sludgy, and low percentage extraction. But
yes,
that's the balance. And if you're looking for, something that's just like liquid melt chocolate, thick stuff, and then a TDS that just hits you in the face, and a lot of people like that style, you can do that. So this machine goes up to 8 mils per second, and it gets that effect. We call it a water hammer. But most of the time, people are looking for some sort of subtlety from their beans, and we don't make it like that.
Sure. There's a question that I just want to clarify for this person. He asks, regarding the puck compression increasing at 10.5 bar, have you had any luck utilizing it to pull better shots, or is it just an interesting effect? I think, to be clear, what we're saying is that you don't want to hit 10.5 bar, because what it does is it compresses the puck and it causes your flow to drop quite a bit. And I can't necessarily explain. I can explain why. We don't like the flavor when that happens, and I believe it's because that crushing of the puck and the shrinking in the flow basically forces the water to find weak spots if it's going to pass through the puck. So we're probably doing a bad thing in terms of how uniform the water will pass through the puck. And I think you would agree that it doesn't taste good. Like when we max out a 10.5 bar and we see the flow drop, like we're never as happy with those shots.
What I think people, yes, is my quick answer, but say you light or an ultralight bean and it's just tasting really acidic and having trouble getting the puck integrity to hold. What I might be doing is I might grind finer and finer and finer, and then it goes to 11, 12 bar, and then the puck integrity holds, and I'm like, woohoo, I finally did it. And you take a sip of it, and indeed it is low acidity, but it's also low flavor. It's just kind of, and I just call it muted. And Scott's got theories on this. I don't have the coffee background to explain why it's muted, but what we find is that, yes, we do conquer acidity by going to those high pressures, but the coffee is completely uninteresting. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And that's where the pressure ceilings could be super interesting.
Yep. And so what John's talking about, the pressure ceiling, is that if the machine senses that you're about to hit whatever, 10 bar, 10.5 bar, or something like that, it will prevent the pressure from rising any higher. This way the flow doesn't collapse on you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we noticed that with Matt Perger was working on his tool, his distribution tool, and we noticed that anyway, I shouldn't get into it because it's too messy, too complicated for this conversation, I think. But
I want to talk about Headspace, so let's get there eventually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's talk about Headspace. Go for it.
Okay. So, I mean, first I'm going to do a shout out to Socratic, who on I believe La Marzocco did Headspace comparison. So just to define what we're talking about how much space there is above the coffee puck when you're making an espresso. So let's say
when it's dry or when it's wet.
Actually, when it's wet, when it's actually making it. But in general, people are talking about when it's dry, and then they see water afterwards. But let's just say you take a 15-gram coffee dose and you try that same dose in a 15, 18, 20, 24-gram basket. Each time you do that, you're going to have more and more space above. What Socratic found, and this is consistent with my findings as well, is that more headspace actually yielded a higher extraction yield. Okay, it also gave them less channeling. And so yeah, they didn't dive into why that was, but for them, that gave them better coffee. Now, some of the theories are that the extra space just allowed for more even wetting. So I'm going to talk about in a second what I think that's right, because there was a criticism of our machine for a long time that we did not make really sludgy coffee. Like people wanted that ice cream like coffee, and some traditional lever machines were better at that. So that was like a 2 years of massive hardware experimentation in the user community, including people modding the machine to try and figure it out. And what they found is that by bringing the filter screen really hard down on the coffee puck, they were able to make much, much thicker, sludgier coffees. Okay,
definitely. I've had that experience too. Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to Socratic. What I think is happening is that when you put water into a puck, it swells. Okay, and by giving it more headspace, it swells more, and water is more evenly distributed. So you get a higher extraction. Now, if you put a barrier away, the coffee puck starts to swell and then can't anymore. Okay, and so it stays higher density. So that when you finally then do rise up to pressure, that coffee puck is like this as opposed to like this. And essentially you end up extracting a lot more emulsion, a lot more oils, and getting a much thicker shot. But you have compromised because you have less evenness. But you'll tend to make a shot that is more chocolatey and less subtle. And if you're using a medium to dark roast, it's likely that you have some unpleasant flavors in there too. And that this technique will tend to hide that. So you'll have less of that burnt forest flavor and more of that chocolate flavor. If you're working on something medium to light, you are going to have a different set of flavors that you're going for, and a more even wetting is going to get you that. You're fighting different things. So so going back to Headspace, when we actually, I mean, there was a huge clan of people who really wanted us to get our filter screen really hard down to the puck, and I think 4 different decent customers made modification kits and sold them, and it was really popular, and people are banging on our door. I remain skeptical, but what we did is we made a kind of hidden community of the top experts, and we pulled them out, and we made a separate group, and then we had them blind taste all these different designs, and also use a refractometer. And in the end, it was very clear that while you could make medium to dark coffee more sludgy with this approach, and a lot of people who want that will keep buying that, the majority of people want more openness, more subtlety in their flavor. And the Headspace that we have does that well. So you also compromise in about 2 to 3% in terms of extraction yield by getting that puck not allowing it to swell.
Okay. That's a lot. That's surprising. Ryan here asks, would it not make sense to fill the headspace more quickly versus slowly? I'll tell my take on this, and you can shoot me down if you think I'm full of it. I think that if your puck prep is great, I think that a fast pre-infusion fill is good in the sense that the time between getting the top of the puck wet and the bottom of the puck wet is shorter, so you'll potentially get a more even extraction. But if your puck prep is not so good, you know, a fast pre-infusion fill is probably going to make you channel more likely. So I've kind of felt like, you know, very slow pre-infusion fills are safer, but you won't hit as many home runs with them. Do you think that's valid, or do you think there's more to it or something else to it?
So I guess the first thing is, you and I have not talked about this actually, is I almost feel like there's 2 worlds of espresso. There's medium to dark and there's medium to light. And I don't even want to talk about general trends unless I split that world completely. Because how you extract one is really quite different from how you extract another. So if you don't have much headspace and you slam that puck with 16 bar and your coffee's nice and dark, you're going to pull a short ristretto that's super thick. It's going to be really consistent. It's going to be like $6 per pound wholesale beans. And the public that wants that's going to be super happy. And there you go. There's Italy, right? That totally, absolutely works, right? Super roasted beans, hard. It's not like the Italians don't know how to make their style of coffee. Right. And that totally works. Now, if you take something, and that bean is extremely soluble, so it does not need much time touching water to give out its coffee material. And also, unpleasant flavors come out quickly, but you know, I got sugar here, so what's the problem? Right. And that coffee cost me €1, and I'm just going to go like this. You know, I'm not going to sit here and think about it. So, totally different approach to coffee. When you've got coffee that's poorly soluble, right, which is most of the coffee that's not following the Italian tradition, there's a couple things you need to worry about. One is you need to make sure that your coffee is all wet before you start extracting it. Ideally, it's evenly wet and none of it's breaking down. Okay? I'm sorry it's going to happen, but Rayo fanboy at times. Scott, without any data, you did go really far in espresso, and there's been so many times where later I actually had the data and I went, how did Scott figure this out? Um, and when you made the blooming shot, you didn't really, I think through what was so innovative about it. I want to talk about blooming because there's three kinds of espresso I make now. And that's a traditional espresso like you got on the screen. There's an allongé, which you also made 20 years ago. And again, I don't think you understood what was so innovative about it. And then blooming. Now, blooming sounds like it's just an espresso with a hole in the center, right? So that chart that Scott has up there looks just like the previous espresso, except there's a 30-second pause in it. But there is a huge, massive difference, and that difference is pre-infusion. So normally when you've got a coffee puck, you start putting water in it, and it swells, and we use capillary action, right? So water is just spreading around. When it then finally swells the coffee puck, it starts to compact, and we compress. The problem with that approach is that the water is hitting the top of the puck much sooner than on the bottom. And Scott, you absolutely hated when I made Slayer shots that are like at 2 mils per second, because water hits the bottom of the puck 37 seconds after the top of the puck.
Yes.
And so what you get out of a Slayer shot is a shot that is simultaneously over-extracted on the top and under-extracted on the bottom, right? And you're like, nothing good ever came out of Slayer. Like, that's a bit extreme.
No, I didn't say that. You can't say that. No, I have respect that the machines are very versatile. I want to be clear.
Okay, but what you did do is I think you were upset by the fact that I was interested in Slayer shots, and you were like, I'm going to figure out what is good there. And there is something really good there, which is making sure that the puck with light roast is evenly wet. And what you did with blooming, and we can see it here on this chart, is you are doing two kinds of saturation at once. So on the one hand, so the blooming shot dumps a whole bunch of water as fast as we can onto the puck and then holds the pressure. And the amount of water we put onto the puck is how much we think the puck will eventually need. Okay, that's kind of weird. And then what we do is we hold the pressure. So this puck is being saturated two ways: one with capillary action, and secondly with about 5 bars of pressure. So we're using pressure to hard push the known amount of water into the puck. And that you can see from the 5 bars there at about 12 seconds. So we put a whole lot of water in, and then we got a little bit of dripping. That's what that brown line on the bottom is. So it's not a perfect technique. Some of the water does go through the bottom, and we get about 6-7 milliliters of dripping that comes through. But the end result blooming is an extremely even extraction, because I mean, typically like 6 seconds into it, I can see water on the bottom, and I can see it go out like this. So the differential between the top and the bottom is only about 6 seconds, even though your total pre-infusion is 44 seconds. So the blooming gives us the highest extractions in the world because it is the one technique.
So you cut out for the last 15 seconds. Okay. So I'm going to take a second and back up for everybody in case they haven't used the Decent. And Ryan asked this question. Here's what the blooming shot is, if it's not clear. We initiate pre-infusion with a very high flow. Once we reach, I think it's between 4 or 5 bar, typically for me, on the pre-infusion pressure, what we do is we stop introducing water. We let the pressure drop slowly. We're no longer applying new pressure to push the water through. And for 30 seconds, we're letting that puck bloom, just like if you're making a V60 and you do a bloom after a pre-infusion. And then after this 30-second bloom, we're ramping up the pressure, hopefully to around 9 bar, and then running a pressure profile well, actually it's a flow profile. It's a flat flow profile that makes the pressure go up and then slowly decline. So we have 3 phases. We have pre-infusion, we have a 30-second bloom, and then we have a flow profile after. And the idea that got me excited to try the blooming was simply that this very long bloom would probably dissolve a lot of stuff in the puck, make the extraction more even because the bottom of the puck would get hotter and would have a lot more access to clean water than it usually does in a regular espresso machine, and then we would just get a ton more extraction and evenness, which can only be a good thing. Um, uh, so we lost John. I'm gonna re-invite John. Give us 1 second here. Sorry about that. Ryan, does the heat change the flavor? Not really. I mean, we're not using crazy hot water. Somebody just asked, I was just explaining to people, John, what the blooming shot is. I don't know if you heard any of that. Ryan asked if the heat changes the flavor because I was talking about the bottom of the puck being hotter in the blooming shots. And I guess I could say it might change the flavor, but it's certainly not a bad thing. Because in a regular espresso shot, we're actually used to drinking espresso where the bottom of the puck probably gets most of its extraction done at extremely low temperatures, like maybe 70 or 80 Celsius. And the blooming is probably the only way to jack it up to. Oh, you okay there? Wow, that looks painful. Okay,
It's like a Star Trek
so
moment, where the
yes.
camera.
Okay, so anyway, I had my spiel about what the blooming shot is, and I'm not sure where exactly you were, but maybe you know.
I don't know how much you lost of me, so you'll have to tell me.
Okay. Well,
I'm just going to put the phone.
I think you know what I think we've got about 7 minutes left. I think we covered the most important parts of the blooming. I'd love to talk about the allongé since we have a few more minutes. And this is a very different type of shot. This is a very fast flow shot. The allongé came up because about 12, 14 years ago, I owned a cafe in Montreal. And in Montreal, they like to pull this thing called allongé, which is a very fast flowing large espresso. It's like a 5 ounce or 150 ml espresso in Montreal. And so we were the first cafe in Montreal to set up a second grinder just for the allongé. We ground coarser, and we ended up getting effectively like a 22 to 23% extraction with these allongé shots using a traditional espresso machine, an E61 machine, and they were like fruit bombs. They were very hard to control in terms of preventing channeling, but when they were good, they were amazing, and we blew away a lot of coffee industry professionals who came in and were shocked that they could enjoy a 5 or 6 ounce espresso. That's my spiel about allongé. So I'm going to pass it on to you now, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Can you hear me, John?
Okay. Just to make sure, can I get a comment on there that you guys can hear? Scott.
You were breaking up a little here, but I hear you now.
I'm hoping that's working. I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Okay. So the light roasts, that they're less soluble. So we know that. And less soluble means that they don't give up their material to water. That's the definition, right? So there's kind of two ways to solve that. You can either have coffee touch water longer, or you can have more water pass through the coffee. Either way, you deal with the lower solubility of the light roast. Okay, the blooming shot deals with this problem by having a longer water contact time. So it takes one approach, and still makes an espresso. By that I mean it's still under pressure. You still get crema. It still looks like something that you know. The allongé approach takes the opposite, which is instead of having a lot of water contact time, it has a lot of water. So that's how we're dealing with light roasts. Now, what we're doing with light, allongé is my favorite technique for light and ultralight that normally are incredibly acidic because they really are poorly soluble. And acidity is just a problem to conquer with that. So what the allongé is doing is it's still a 9-bar espresso. So it's still extracting under the kind of pressures we're used to, but with a much higher flow rate, which is then dealing with that solubility. So a normal espresso is going to be somewhere between a half mil per second, if you want that thick Italian thing, to let's say 1.5, 2 mils per second. That's the Italian world. And then for light roast, we're typically in the 1.5 to 3 mils per second. And that's if you're trying to get an espresso that looks like a normal espresso that you're used to, something like 40 to 50 milliliters in the cup. The allongé is going to end up with a lot more in the cup because we're putting a lot of water through. Now, the reason this shot is super interesting is dial in with a traditional machine, but you can do it. So I'm just going to give a recipe. If you don't have a decent espresso machine and you want to do this, here's how you do it. You're aiming for a 5-to-1 ratio in a 30-second time. You might even go to 60 seconds, to 6-to-1. So weigh out your beans. Let's say you're doing 18 grams, multiply by 5, and hit that in your 30 seconds time. Now, the challenge is that your machine's not going to show you the real pressure. So the decent espresso machine shows you the pressure. And if you do this at 3 or 4 bar, it tastes terrible. So with a traditional machine, what you're going to do is you're going to by doing 40 seconds, you know that you actually are at pressure. And then you're going to just slightly coarsen your grind till you hit around 30 seconds. Now, what you're going to get is actually an espresso. It's going to have crema because it is under pressure. But you will find it to be incredibly fruity because this approach is going to get more water flow through your beans than any other way of making espresso. It's super hard to dial in on a traditional machine. You can do it, and Scott alluded to consistency problems he had. But when you do, you will find that this is the secret technique to unlocking those beans that when you open them up, they smell amazing and they always taste terrible. So these are the 3 espressos I'm making: traditional blooming for a pause, or high water flow allongé. And for me, this is the biggest thing about the decent espresso machine is there were these 2 recipes out there in the universe that solved real coffee problems. And
Yep.
thank you, Scott.
Oh, thank you. It's been awesome. I can never go back to making espresso without the feedback of the graphs, and I love the idea that like when I have something like a light roast Kenya that I would normally be wary of pulling as an espresso, I'm excited to pull it as an Allongé, and it does solve a lot of problems. We're in our last minute, so I don't want Instagram to cut us off. So thanks for taking an hour to talk to us. Sorry, folks, for the little bit of technical problems there. Hopefully, 99% of what we said was audible. Um, and I hope you can hear me, John. I think you're frozen, but anyway, I hope to talk to you soon. And thanks everybody for joining. You there, John? Oh. I'm going to turn it off now, John. I think we lost you.